the Hinterkaifeck murders, unsolved mystery in rural Germanur. Lying down, maybe your room is dark or lit only by a small dim lamp. Outside, the world continues to move, but in here, it's just you, your breathing, and a story. Tonight's file, 002, is heavy. It's about a family, a farm, and a crime that still chills the air of rural Germany to this very day. We're not here to sensationalize the horror. We're here to understand the mystery and what happens when evil slips through the cracks of an isolated world. Breathe slowly. Let your mind relax. Tonight, we'll journey into one of the darkest mysteries to ever unfold in the quiet countryside. A tale of brutal murders, fear, and the unexplainable actions of a killer who stayed hidden in plain sight. But don't worry, this is a space for comfort, not fear. If at any point the story feels too heavy, let it slip into the background and let your mind drift into rest. Make sure to hit subscribe to join me on these nightly journeys through unsolved mysteries, told gently for a restful night's sleep. With each story, we uncover chilling secrets, and with each breath, we sink deeper into relaxation. The case of the Hinterkaifeck murders. In 1922, 6 members of the Gruber family were murdered on their isolated farm, Hinterkaifeck, in the deep forests of Bavaria. The crime was violent, brutal, but it wasn't just the murder itself that made it one of the most chilling cases in history. It was what came after the crime. You see, the killer didn't flee, they stayed. They walked the hallways, fed the animals, used the family's food, and moved freely through the house, all without being detected. It was as if the killer had become a part of the house itself, a phantom who belonged there, a phantom who would leave a trail of questions and an ever-growing sense of dread without ever revealing their face. Imagine a world where no one is safe, even in the confines of their own home. The investigation turned up many suspects. Some thought the killer was someone the Grubers knew, someone who was familiar with the family's routines, their isolation, and their vulnerabilities. But after years of searching and many theories, the truth remains a mystery, locked away in the shadows. Tonight, we will explore this eerie case together. We'll walk through the isolated corridors of the Gruber farm, feel the cold silence that lingered long after the murders, and dive into the psychological depth of a killer who stayed long after the crime was committed. But don't worry, we'll take it slow. No rush, no fear, just you, your breath, and the story. So, let your mind wander as we journey through one of the most unsettling and unsolved true crime cases in history. Chapter 1. The Arrival. At Hinterkaifeck, mist hung low over the fields as Paul's car crunched its way through the narrow, uneven roads that led to the small, forgotten village of Hinterkaifeck. The weather was cold, uninviting, a thick gray sky above, casting a dull pall over the landscape. As he looked through the fogged-up window, the village barely visible in the distance, Paul couldn't shake the sensation that he was entering a place that had long since been abandoned by time itself. Everything about Hinterkaifeck seemed frozen in a past it could never escape. The houses here were old, their stones weathered by years of harsh winters and neglect. Paul, a seasoned investigator from Munich, had seen his fair share of grisly crime scenes. But something about this case felt different, something that gnawed at him as soon as the assignment had been handed to him. He had heard the rumors, the whispers in the streets, the stories of a family slaughtered in their own home, the eerie silence that followed, and now here he was, stepping into that silence, ready to confront the mystery that had baffled so many. The murders had happened nearly a week ago, but the bloodstains, the remnants of the family's lives, still lingered in the air like ghosts. There was a sinister feeling about the place, a presence that Paul couldn't quite place. As he walked through the small village square, not a single soul was in sight. The villagers, those few who remained, hid behind closed doors. The village, so isolated from the world, had no one but itself to depend on. It was a place out of time, where secrets festered like wounds left untreated. In the distance, the Hinterkaifeck farmstead loomed, surrounded by fields that stretched far into the horizon. The house stood in stark contrast to the quietude around, its windows dark, its door slightly ajar, as though it were waiting for him. A flashback unfolded in his mind as Paul remembered the details he had read about in the case file. The Gruber family, a mother, father, and 2 children, had been slaughtered in their own home. Their deaths were horrific, brutal, and yet what was most chilling was the manner in which the killer had stayed in the house for days after the murders. The killer had used the family's food, walked around in their shoes, and lived among the dead without ever being detected. How could someone commit such a gruesome act and then return to the scene of the crime unchallenged for days? Paul couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew that this was no ordinary case. Something was wrong with this place, this farm, this village. And as he walked toward the house, he felt as if the very air around him was thick with secrets, pressing in from every direction. Chapter 2. The first clue. The heavy wooden door creaked as Paul pushed it open. The house greeted him with an eerie silence. A lingering smell of decay mixed with the cold scent of damp wood filled the air. The floorboards beneath his feet groaned as if protesting his presence, but Paul paid them no mind. His attention was fixed on the scene before him. The remnants of the Gruber family's last days. The family had been found in the most grotesque of circumstances, strangled, bludgeoned, and shot. The bodies had been left in their beds, sprawled across the floor, and in one case, thrown into the attic. The killer had gone to extreme lengths, making sure to cover every trace of his identity. The only thing that remained was the terror that had lived in these walls for so long. Paul stepped carefully through the house, his eyes darting between the scattered belongings. The children's toys lay abandoned on the floor, a chair overturned beside a blood-stained table. An old clock ticked away in the corner, as if mocking the passage of time in a place that had stopped moving. He reached for his notebook, his hands trembling slightly as he began to take in the details. His first thought was that this was no random act of violence. The killer knew the family, knew their routines, their habits. The fact that the killer had spent days in the house, even after committing the crime, meant something more. But what? Was it revenge, a personal vendetta, or something darker? The investigation was just beginning, and Paul's mind raced with the possibilities. He turned his attention to a small room off the kitchen, its door slightly ajar. Inside, he found something that made his stomach turn. A child's drawing on the wall, scribbled in dark, frantic strokes. The drawing depicted the family, but it was distorted, the faces twisted into grotesque expressions. But what chilled Paul the most was the message scrawled beneath the drawing. "They are watching." The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Who had left this behind? As Paul examined the drawing further, he felt the creeping sense of dread settle deeper into his bones. This wasn't just a murder. It was something more, a message, a threat. But from whom? And why? The investigation was unfolding, but Paul couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him now. The case had already begun to take root in his mind, and he couldn't escape it. The questions were piling up faster than he could answer them. His next step was to speak to the villagers, but even before he left the house, Paul could feel an unspoken tension in the air, a force that he couldn't quite explain. Every corner of the house seemed to hold a secret. Every creaking floorboard was a whisper, every shadow a memory of what had happened here. Chapter 3. Unearthly silence. The village was empty as Paul made his way back through the streets, his footsteps echoing through the narrow lanes. The silence was suffocating. He passed by small houses with peeling paint, their windows boarded up or darkened. Not a single soul was out, and even the dogs were quiet. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. It was as if the village itself was holding its breath. Paul was used to the isolation of rural towns, but this felt different. There was a strange energy to Hinterkaifeck, something he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the gruesome nature of the crime, it was the atmosphere. The tension in the air was palpable. It was as if the village had been holding a collective breath for years, waiting for something to happen. And now that it had, the residents seemed to be retreating even further into their shells. Too afraid to speak, Paul approached the local inn where the few remaining villagers had gathered. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken words. The innkeeper, an older man with graying hair and a face lined with age, looked up at Paul as he entered, but said nothing. The other patrons, huddled together at a corner table, stared silently. Paul took a seat at the bar and ordered a drink, trying to shake off the chill that had taken hold of him. He wasn't sure what it was, but something about the way the villagers were behaving felt off. They seemed to know more than they were letting on, but every time Paul tried to engage them, they fell silent, casting wary glances in his direction. "Did you know the Grubers?" Paul asked, trying to break the tension. "What can you tell me about what happened here?" The innkeeper's hand trembled as he set the glass down in front of Paul. "We don't talk about it," he said softly. "Not here." Not now, Paul frowned. Why? What are you hiding? The innkeeper shook his head, not meeting Paul's gaze. You won't find the answers here, he said, his voice low and strained. The answers are in the house, but beware, something evil is still there. And it's not just the killer you should fear. As Paul stared at the man, trying to understand the cryptic warning, the room fell eerily quiet. The other villagers looked away, unwilling to meet his eyes. The tension in the inn was suffocating. It was clear that the villagers were afraid. But afraid of what? Of the killer, or something else, something more sinister. Paul didn't know yet, but the pieces were starting to fall into place. Something was wrong with this place. Something that went far beyond the murders themselves. The first clue had been uncovered, and it led him back to the house. But as Paul turned to leave, the innkeeper's words echoed in his mind. Beware, something evil is still there. It was a warning that he couldn't ignore. Chapter 4. The mysterious witness. The night was heavy with fog as Paul stood near the edge of the village, the only sound being the soft rustling of the trees. He'd spent the day questioning the villagers, those few brave enough to speak about the murders. Most of them had little to say, as if the tragedy had swallowed their words, leaving behind nothing but silence. But tonight, a new lead had appeared. A hunched figure stepped out from behind the shadows, his coat pulled tightly around him. He was an old man, his face weathered with age and hardship, his eyes clouded with the weight of time. He approached Paul slowly, as though unsure whether he should be there, yet driven by something beyond his control. His name was Johann, a former farmhand who had worked on the Gruber farm decades ago. Johann's voice trembled as he spoke, a distant look in his eyes. I saw him, he said, his words catching in his throat. A figure, a shadow, near the farm, days before, ... Paul's heart skipped a beat. He'd heard rumors about a mysterious stranger, a shadowy figure seen near the property in the days leading up to the murders. Now, it seemed there was someone who had actually witnessed the figure, Johann continued, his hands shaking. I don't know who he was, but he wasn't like anyone I've seen before. He was tall, with long, dark hair. His clothes, they were strange, not from around here. He moved like he was trying to hide, watching the farm from the trees. I told the others, but they didn't want to hear it. They were too afraid. I was too afraid. Paul's mind raced. This was the break he needed. The figure Johann described sounded like the same one the villagers had whispered about. But what was his connection to the Gruber family? And more importantly, what did this mean for the investigation? Was he the killer? Or was he another victim? Someone caught in the web of tragedy surrounding the murders. As Paul pressed Johann for more details, the old man hesitated, as if reluctant to revisit the painful memories. His hands clenched, and he looked away, his eyes narrowing as though trying to shut out the image of the shadowy figure. There's more, Johann whispered, his voice low. The night before the murders, I saw the figure again, but this time he wasn't alone. There was someone with him, a woman, I think, but I couldn't see her face clearly. They were close, too close to the house. And then nothing. I never saw them again. Paul's pulse quickened. A woman. The connection between the figure and the woman intrigued him. Who were they? What had brought them to the farm? The mystery deepened, and Paul's obsession with the case grew. Johann's story was a glimpse into something much darker than he had anticipated. There were forces at play here, forces that reached beyond a simple murder investigation. He had to find out who these figures were and what they had to do with the Gruber family. But more than that, he had to understand why the killer had stayed in the house for days. What did they want, and what was the connection to the past? As Johann slowly backed away into the fog, his words lingered in the air. Be careful, investigator. There's something in those woods, ... something that shouldn't be there. Chapter 5. Ghosts of the Past. The days began to blur together as Paul delved deeper into the mystery. The investigation had taken a strange turn, but it was clear now that the answers he sought would not come easily. The village, with its dark corners and heavy silence, was more than a backdrop, was a character in itself, holding its breath and waiting for something to break. Paul returned to the Gruber house, his every step weighed down by the knowledge of the horrors that had occurred here. But something had changed. As he walked through the rooms once more, the shadows seemed to move with him, lingering in the corners of his vision. The house, with its peeling wallpaper and cracked floors, felt more alive than ever before. It was in the attic that Paul found the first of the Gruber family's belongings that seemed to hold more than just sentimental value. A family portrait, tarnished with age, hung crookedly on the wall. In it, the Grubers were smiling, their faces full of life. But there was something strange about their expressions, something that Paul couldn't quite place. The mother, Andreas Gruber, had a subtle sadness in her eyes that no one had mentioned before. The father, Georg, had a rigidity to his posture that seemed unnatural. And the children, their faces innocent yet distant, almost as though they were caught in a moment that didn't belong to them. But it was the background of the portrait that caught Paul's attention, a small figure standing in the shadows behind the family. The figure was hard to make out, but it seemed out of place. Paul reached for his magnifying glass, studying the image closer. It was a person standing just beyond the edges of the family, hidden but undeniably present. Could this be the shadowy figure Johann had spoken of? Or was this a figment of the Gruber's troubled past? As Paul continued to sift through the belongings, he came across more unsettling artifacts, letters, journals, and photographs that seemed to tell a story of their own. One letter, dated just a month before the murders, stood out in particular. It was from Georg Gruber to a distant relative in a neighboring town. The letter was short, but its contents were chilling. There are things that have happened on the farm that we cannot explain. I fear that something evil is following us. I cannot shake the feeling that it will come for us next. Paul felt a cold shiver run down his spine. What had Georg Gruber known? Was this letter a sign of the growing dread that had settled on the family? Or had they known something Paul had yet to uncover? As the night deepened, Paul sat alone in the dimly lit attic, the weight of the family's history pressing down on him. The air was thick with the sense that he was being watched, and the house seemed to whisper around him, urging him to understand the secrets it held. Flashbacks of the Gruber's final days began to unfold in Paul's mind. He saw their last moments, their final attempts to protect themselves from an unknown threat. The house had become a tomb, its walls now haunted by the echoes of the family's fear. Paul couldn't shake the feeling that the ghosts of the past were still lingering here, waiting for him to uncover the truth. Chapter 6. The first breakthrough came unexpectedly. It wasn't a dramatic revelation or a sudden epiphany, but rather a small discovery that would prove to be the first piece in a much larger puzzle. Paul had been searching the Gruber house for hours, his mind consumed with the strange events of the past few days. His exhaustion was beginning to take its toll when he noticed something peculiar beneath. A loose floorboard in the corner of the kitchen. There, hidden away, was a small compartment, its contents carefully tucked inside. With trembling hands, Paul pried open the compartment and found a folded piece of paper. The note was old, the edges frayed and yellowed with age, but it was legible. The handwriting was erratic, hurried, as though the writer had been in a state of panic when they had written it. The house is not safe. The shadow follows me. It is not human. It must be stopped before it takes us all. Paul's heart pounded in his chest. This was a warning one that had been left behind long ago, yet somehow tied directly to the murders. The figure, the shadow, was more than just a person. It was something else entirely. Something that had lingered in the shadows of the Gruber family's history, waiting for the right moment to strike. But what was the shadow? And why had the family left this message? As Paul looked at the note, he felt the creeping sense of dread that had haunted him since the beginning of this investigation. This was no ordinary crime. It was a puzzle that reached far beyond the murders themselves. And as the mystery deepened, so did Paul's obsession with uncovering the truth. The first break had come, but it raised more questions than answers. The shadow was no longer just a figure in the past, it was something tangible, something that had existed long before the Gruber's deaths. And now, Paul was determined to find out what it was, even if it meant uncovering the darkest secrets of the village. Chapter 7. Unseen Presence. Paul had never spent a night in a murder house before, but something about this case drove him to do so. He had to understand the full depth of the Gruber family's death. There were too many unanswered questions, too many strange occurrences for him to ignore. But the night he spent alone at Hinterkaifeck would haunt him for the rest of his life. The wind howled through the cracks of the old house, and the wood creaked in response to its icy breath. Paul sat in the corner of the main room, the shadows stretching long across the floor, flickering in the dim light of the oil lamp. His eyes darted nervously around, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The room felt alive. Every crack and groan of the building speaking to him as if the house itself was trying to communicate. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that settled over you like a thick fog, pressing in on your mind. Paul's heartbeat quickened, and he couldn't stop his thoughts from racing. He'd heard stories from the villagers' stories about the house's eerie presence, the feeling that something never truly left after the murders. Tonight, he was determined to find out whether those stories were true. He stood and walked slowly through the darkened rooms, each one colder than the last. The walls seemed to close in around him as he passed through the narrow hallways. Every creak of the floorboards felt like someone else was walking with him, just out of sight. The house whispered, its secrets swirling around him, pulling him deeper into the mystery. As he passed the stairs to the attic, he hesitated. The attic had been the site of so much pain. The bodies of the Grubers had been found there, piled in a grotesque heap. Paul had searched the attic earlier, but there was something unsettling about it that drew him back. Now, the air in the attic was thick with dust, and the shadows seemed to stretch forever. Paul moved cautiously toward the center of the room, where a faint outline of a door could be seen, hidden beneath a pile of old furniture. It was as if the house was deliberately concealing something, refusing to let him uncover its secrets. As he reached out to touch the door, a sudden chill ran through his body, and a noise echoed from somewhere behind him. A soft creak, then the distinct sound of something or someone moving through the floorboards. His heart raced as he spun around, but the room was empty. His breath came in short bursts as he fought to calm himself, but the unease only deepened. It was as if the house was alive, its presence pushing him toward something he wasn't ready to find. For hours, Paul sat in the dark, every creak, every gust of wind, every shadow making him jump. He could feel it now, the undeniable presence of something that shouldn't be there, something ancient, something vengeful, watching him from the dark corners of the house. Was it the spirit of the Gruber family? Or was it something worse, something far more sinister? He didn't know, but he couldn't escape the feeling that the house was never meant to be inhabited again. Chapter 8. Breaking point. As the days wore on, Paul's obsession with the case deepened. The house, once just a crime scene, had become a living, breathing entity in his mind. It consumed his thoughts, his every waking moment. He spent hours poring over old documents, piecing together the last few months of the Gruber family's lives. The more he uncovered, the more the darkness seemed to close in around him. One night, he woke in a cold sweat, his heart racing. He had a vivid, unsettling image of the Gruber family in their final moments. The family standing together in the kitchen, unaware of the impending horror that awaited them. And then, as the vision deepened, Paul saw the shadowy figure from Johann's description lurking in the background, watching them with cold, empty eyes. The figure didn't belong to any of the villagers. It didn't belong to anyone Paul knew. It was something else, something older, something that had been lying in wait for years. The vision faded, leaving Paul gasping for air. He wiped the sweat from his brow, trying to shake off the overwhelming sense of dread that had washed over him. But it lingered, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. He couldn't escape it. The mystery of the Gruber murders was no longer just an investigation. It was a personal battle, one that he didn't know if he was strong enough to fight. The following day, Paul began to question his own mind. The line between reality and obsession was starting to blur. Was he losing touch with what was real? The dreams, the visions, the overwhelming sense that he was being watched. They couldn't all be coincidences. They were signs that Paul had crossed a line he couldn't come back from. As the investigation continued, he felt himself slipping further and further into paranoia. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind seemed to carry a hidden message. Was he just imagining things, or was there something truly sinister at play? His grip on reality was slipping, and the more he tried to regain control, the more elusive it became. He spent his nights in the Gruber house, hoping to uncover something, anything that could explain what had happened here. But each night brought him closer to the brink of madness. His mind played tricks on him. He heard whispers in the walls. He saw shadows moving out of the corner of his eye. The house seemed to close in on him, pushing him to the edge of sanity. It wasn't just the case that was driving him mad, it was the house itself. The more he stayed, the more he felt its pull, its power over him. And yet he couldn't leave. Not until he found the truth. Not until he uncovered what lay hidden in the darkness. Chapter 9. Descent into Darkness. Paul had always prided himself on his ability to remain composed, his ability to separate himself from the emotional chaos of a case. But as the days turned into weeks, he found himself consumed by the mystery. The lines between the investigator and the case had blurred completely. He was no longer just a man seeking justice. He was a man obsessed with uncovering the truth, no matter the cost. One evening, while sifting through the old family records and journals, Paul found something that made his blood run cold. A diary, a small, leather-bound book, was hidden beneath the floorboards in the Gruber's bedroom. He'd searched the room countless times before, but this was the first time he noticed the hidden compartment. Inside the diary, written in the delicate hand of Andreas Gruber, were the family's final thoughts before their deaths. The entries were disturbing. They spoke of fear of something lurking in the shadows, something that had been following them for months. But it was the last entry that truly chilled Paul to the core. It comes closer now. I can feel it watching us. It is no longer content with watching from afar. It wants us all. We are running out of time. As Paul read the words, his heart pounded in his chest. The Grubers had known. They had known something was coming. But what and why had they not told anyone? The diary provided no answers, only more questions. The figure, the shadow, the sense of foreboding. It was all connected, but to what? What had brought the Gruber family to this terrible end? As Paul read on, the diary began to reveal even more disturbing truths about the family's dynamics. The relationship between Georg and Andreas was strained. filled with tension and bitterness. There were hints of long-buried secrets, betrayals, lies, and hidden fears. But what truly disturbed Paul was the repeated mention of a curse that had plagued the family for generations. The curse. Was this what had driven them to their deaths? Was the shadowy figure just a manifestation of the family's deep, hidden fears? Or was it something far darker, something that had been following the Grubers for years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? Paul couldn't escape the feeling that the house was pulling him deeper into its web. The more he uncovered, the more the darkness seemed to swallow him whole. The investigation had started as a quest for justice, but now it was something else entirely. It was a descent into madness, a journey into the heart of a mystery that threatened to consume him. He didn't know how much longer he could keep going, but he knew one thing for certain. The answers were within reach. He just had to survive long enough to uncover them. Chapter 10. The revelation. The winds outside howled through the cracked windows of the Gruber family's once pristine farmhouse. The night thick with the promise of an unspeakable truth. Paul sat at the small wooden desk, surrounded by the disarray of years of investigation. His hands trembled slightly as he sifted through the scattered notes, photographs, and records he had accumulated in his relentless pursuit of answers. But as the pages of the case file rustled beneath his fingers, a new sensation crept into his chest, something heavier than mere curiosity. It was dread, a sinking feeling, the kind that came when you realized you were closer to the truth than you had ever wanted to be. He'd spent weeks in this house, meticulously combing through every corner, every detail. The Gruber family's final days had unfolded before him like a dark, twisted story, a tale written in blood and betrayal. And yet, with every turn, with every uncovered clue, Paul had felt himself slipping deeper into the madness of the case. But tonight, the room felt colder, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to find something it had hidden for so long. The truth was close, so close that Paul could feel it in his bones. The door creaked open, and Paul glanced up, expecting to see the familiar, weathered face of Johann, the old villager who had been helping him piece together the history of the farm. But the figure who stepped into the room was not Johann. It was a man he had seen before, someone he had barely taken notice of, a face that had blended into the shadows of the village. This man, however, was not a stranger. He was someone from Paul's past, someone Paul had been trying to forget. It was Carl, a former colleague, a man who had once been a close friend, now standing before him in the dim light, looking different, haggard, worn down by time and regret. But it wasn't just his appearance that unsettled Paul. It was the fact that Carl had disappeared years ago, long before Paul had ever been assigned to this case. "Carl," Paul asked, his voice barely above a whisper, "what are you doing here?" Carl's gaze flickered nervously to the door, then to the floor. He hesitated, and in that moment, Paul could see the conflict written on his face. The man had a secret, and it was a secret Paul was about to uncover. I didn't want you to find out like this, Carl said, his voice tight with tension. But it's time you knew the truth. Paul stood up, the air between them charged with an intensity that neither man could escape. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft ticking of the old clock on the wall. Paul's heart raced as he looked at Carl, wondering what kind of revelation could possibly tie this man to the brutal murders that had rocked the small village of Hinterkaifeck. You knew about the murders? Paul asked, his voice growing louder with each word. You've been here all along, haven't you? You know something. I know more than you think, Carl interrupted, his eyes darting around the room nervously. I never meant for it to get this far, Paul, but I was involved in ways you can't even begin to understand. Paul froze. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of Carl's words. How could this man, this old colleague from his past, be involved in the Gruber family's deaths? What was he hiding? You don't understand, Carl continued, stepping forward. I was part of it, not in the way you think, but his voice cracked, and he fell silent for a moment, as if gathering the courage to say the words that would change everything. Paul could feel his pulse quickening. He had been so sure of his theories, so confident that the truth was just beyond his reach. But now, as Carl stood before him, Paul realized that the truth was far darker than he had ever imagined. It was more complicated, more personal, and it was tied to Carl in a way that Paul hadn't expected. The shadow you've been chasing, Carl said, his voice trembling. It's not just some stranger. It's me. I was the one who brought the darkness to the Gruber family. Paul took a step back, his mind reeling. What are you saying? Are you telling me I didn't kill them? Carl interrupted quickly, his eyes wide with panic. But I was part of the chain of events that led to their deaths. It was me who let the darkness in. I brought it here, to this house. Paul's stomach twisted in knots. He could feel the weight of the room closing in on him. The walls seemed to pulse with a sickening energy, the air thick with the tension of the revelation that was slowly unfolding. I was involved with a woman, Carl continued, his voice barely above a whisper. A woman who wasn't who she appeared to be. She had power, Paul, dark power. She wanted something from the Grubers, and I helped her. I thought I could control it. I thought I could stop her, but I was wrong, so wrong. Carl's words hung in the air, and Paul felt as if the ground beneath him was crumbling. This wasn't just a murder mystery. This was something far more insidious, something rooted in the supernatural, something far beyond anything Paul had ever believed. The woman Carl spoke of, who was she? What kind of power did she have? And how had she manipulated Carl, drawing him into the web of destruction that had engulfed the Gruber family? Paul could barely process the enormity of the situation. His own past, the personal tragedy he had tried to bury, was now entangled with the horror of the Gruber murders. He had thought that he was merely investigating a crime, seeking justice for a family whose lives had been senselessly taken. But now, Paul realized he was caught in a deeper, darker story, one that tied his own soul to the evil that had infected the village. The woman Carl spoke of, the shadowy figure that had stalked the Gruber family, was not just a random killer. She was something much worse. And Carl had been part of it all along. "I didn't know how to stop her," Carl said, his voice breaking. "I thought if I helped her get what she wanted, she'd leave. But she didn't. She destroyed them. And now she's coming for me, Paul. She's coming for us both." The room felt colder, darker. Paul's thoughts were swirling in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He had known the Gruber family had secrets, but he had never expected this. The supernatural, the darkness, the betrayal, everything was connected, and it was all tied to Carl, to the past they both shared. "I can help you stop her," Paul said, his voice low and steady, even though his heart was pounding in his chest. "We'll figure this out together. But you have to tell me everything." Carl's eyes were wide with fear, but there was a glimmer of hope in them now, too. He nodded slowly, and for the first time in years, Paul saw a man who was truly broken, a man who had been consumed by the darkness he had helped unleash. As the two of them stood there, the weight of the revelation pressing down on them, Paul knew that his investigation had taken an irreversible turn. The truth was no longer just about solving a crime. It was about survival. And as the shadow of the past loomed closer, Paul could feel the dark forces that had been unleashed coming for him, too. Chapter 11. Confronting the killer. The tension in the village was palpable as Paul stood at the threshold of the abandoned barn, his breath fogging in the cold night air. It was here that he had traced the last known movements of the shadowy figure who had haunted his every step. The figure, once just a fleeting image in his nightmares, had now materialized into something more real, more dangerous. It was not just the killer he was after. It was the unraveling of a life he thought he understood, a path that had led him down a rabbit hole filled with deceit, betrayal, and confusion. His investigation had come to this crossroads, the one he feared. With every passing day, the lines between the investigator and the case had blurred further. The deeper he dug, the more entangled he became in the web of lies and shadows. But there was no turning back now. The barn, cold and dark, stood in front of him like a silent sentinel, keeping its secrets from prying eyes. The door creaked as Paul pushed it open, stepping into the shadow of a nightmare he had never imagined. Inside, the barn was empty, save for the few remnants of forgotten memories, empty hay bales, rusted farm equipment, and the faint scent of decay. But it wasn't the physical emptiness that Paul sensed. It was the deep, unnerving silence, a silence that clung to the walls like a presence, watching, waiting. "Paul," a voice called out, breaking the stillness. He froze. It was a voice he had hoped to never hear again. His heart skipped a beat as he turned to face the man standing in the far corner, shrouded in darkness. "Carl," Paul said, his voice low and steady. "What are you doing here?" Carl, the man whose secrets had begun to unravel the very foundation of Paul's life, stepped forward. His face was gaunt, eyes hollow, as if the years of hiding in the shadows had taken their toll. The guilt, the fear, it all radiated from him. "I didn't want this to happen, Paul," Carl said, his voice filled with regret. "I never wanted it to go this far." Paul's mind raced. The man who had once been his mentor, his colleague, was standing in front of him. And yet everything he thought he knew about Carl had been shattered. The man was no longer the person he had trusted. No, Carl had been the one who had kept the secrets, who had hidden the truth for far too long. "You're the one, aren't you?" Paul demanded, his anger rising. "You're the one who's been pulling the strings behind all of this. The murders, the lies. You set it all in motion, didn't you?" Carl's shoulders sagged, his face crumpling in shame. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said, voice cracking. "It was supposed to be different. She promised me. She promised me that it would end, but it never did." The woman, the mysterious figure Carl had mentioned before, she was the key. Paul had thought she was a figment of Carl's guilt, a ghost from his past. But now it was clear. She was real. And Carl was not just an innocent bystander in the tragedy that had befallen the Gruber family. No, he had played a role in their deaths. "Who is she, Carl?" Paul pressed. "What did she promise you? What was her connection to the Grubers?" Carl looked away, his eyes distant, lost in the shadows of his memories. "Her name is Evelyn," he whispered, as if speaking her name was a sin. "She was the one who led us all here. She knew things about the Grubers, about their past, their weaknesses. She wanted something from them, something they refused to give." Paul took a step forward, his pulse quickening. This was it, the truth, the long-awaited answer that had eluded him for so long. But it was worse than he could have ever imagined. "What was it she wanted?" Paul asked, his voice rising in desperation. "Why the Grubers? Why them?" Carl hesitated, his hands trembling. "She wanted their legacy," he said, his words hanging in the air like a death sentence. "Their bloodline, their land. She knew something about their family, something that had been passed down through generations. But it was more than that. It was power. Evelyn wanted to control it all, and she used me, used all of us, to get it." Paul's mind reeled. The Grubers had been more than just a family. They had been the keepers of something ancient, something powerful. The murders, the strange happenings in the house, the shadowy figure that had haunted Paul's every step. Everything made sense now. It was all part of a much larger, darker plan, and Carl had been an unwilling participant in it all. "I didn't know it would end like this," Carl continued, his voice barely a whisper. "She promised me that if I helped her, she would spare me. She promised me that she would leave me alone, that everything would go back to normal. But I was wrong. I was so wrong." Paul's heart twisted with a mix of anger and pity. Carl was a man broken by his own actions, a man who had been manipulated and consumed by the darkness he had helped unleash. But that didn't excuse his part in the deaths of the Gruber family. It didn't excuse the lives that had been destroyed by his betrayal. "Where is she now, Carl?" Paul demanded, his fists clenched. "Where is Evelyn?" Carl's face twisted with fear. She's gone, Paul. She's left the village, but she's not done. She'll never be done, and she's coming for you. She's coming for both of us. Paul's mind swirled with confusion. What did Carl mean? How had this woman, this supernatural figure, gained so much power? And why had she chosen Carl as her ally? The more Paul learned, the more questions piled up. The investigation had taken a turn into the unknown, and there was no way out now. As Paul stood there, facing the man who had once been his friend, he realized that the truth was far worse than he had ever imagined. The case was no longer just a murder investigation. It was a race against time, a fight for survival against an evil that had been festering in the shadows for far too long. Chapter 12. The breaking point. The following days blurred together for Paul. His mind had been reduced to a maze of fractured thoughts, his obsession with the case consuming him more with each passing moment. The small village of Hinterkaifeck, once quiet and forgotten, now seemed like the epicenter of a storm that threatened to swallow him whole. He couldn't escape it. No matter how hard he tried, the case followed him everywhere. The house, the barn, the shadowy figure, every corner of the village whispered secrets that Paul couldn't ignore. But it wasn't just the case that haunted him. It was the darkness inside himself, the part of him that had been awakened by the investigation. The obsession that had started as a need to uncover the truth had grown into something more dangerous, something that threatened to consume him from the inside out. The lines between reality and his own spiraling thoughts began to blur. Was he really seeing what he thought he was seeing? Were the voices he heard at night real? Or was it just his mind playing tricks on him? Every moment he spent in the house, in the village, the more he felt himself slipping further into madness. It wasn't just the murders that had affected him. It was the way the darkness had wormed its way into his soul, poisoning him from within. He stood in the center of the Gruber family's living room, staring at the walls as if they held the answers he needed. The house, which had once seemed like a backdrop to the investigation, now felt like a prison. It was a place where secrets had been buried, but also a place where Paul had buried parts of himself, parts he didn't want to confront. But now the time had come. The time to confront the darkness that had been growing inside him, to face the obsession that had taken root in his soul. He could feel it, crawling beneath his skin, suffocating him with each breath. Paul, a voice called softly from behind him. It was Johann, the old villager, who had warned him about the evil lurking in the house. Johanna's words echoed in his mind, but now they seemed like a distant memory. The warning had come too late. The darkness was already inside him. I've seen it, too, Johann continued, his voice trembling. The shadow. It's not just the killer. It's the house, the land. It's cursed, Paul. And now you're part of it. There's no way out. Paul turned to face Johann, his eyes wild with fear. What do you mean? What are you saying? The curse, Johann whispered, stepping closer. It's not just the murders. It's been here for generations, and now it's inside you. It's in your mind, Paul. You've been marked. Paul staggered back, his mind reeling. The darkness, the obsession it, was all part of something much bigger than he had realized. He had been drawn into the curse, into the very thing he had been trying to uncover. The investigation was no longer just about the Gruber family. It was about his own survival, his own fight against the evil that had consumed them all. As the room around him closed in, Paul realized the truth. The investigation had been his undoing. The darkness was not just the killer. It was the house, the village, the past, and now it was inside him. Chapter 13. The Truth Unveiled. The storm outside raged relentlessly, its furious winds shaking the very bones of the old Gruber house. Inside, however, the house was eerily still, as if holding its breath in anticipation of the final revelations that would tear apart everything Paul thought he knew about the case and himself. For days, he had been trapped in a web of his own making, twisting through the threads of lies, half-truths, and the eerie presence that seemed to follow him wherever he went. But now, in the dead of night, Paul stood on the precipice of truth, about to confront the killer and uncover the hidden history that tied him to the Gruber family's tragic fate. Paul had spent countless hours in this forsaken house, looking for the answers that had eluded him for so long. He had seen shadows move where there were none, heard whispers in the walls, and felt the weight of the family's terror pressing down on him with every breath. But tonight was different. Tonight, the fog of confusion began to lift, and the outline of the killer's true identity started to come into focus. It had started with Carl's revelation, how he had been manipulated by a woman named Evelyn, a woman whose presence had been felt long before Paul had arrived in the village. She had been the catalyst for everything that had unfolded, a dark force that had used Carl as a pawn to unlock the Gruber family's deepest, most dangerous secrets. But Paul had only scratched the surface. The deeper he went, the more he realized that this wasn't just about one man's betrayal. It was about the history of the village itself, the sins buried in its past, and the evil that had festered for generations. The last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place when Paul uncovered the final letter one that had been hidden away in the attic, tucked inside an old chest covered in dust. The letter, dated nearly a century ago, had been written by none other than Georg Gruber, the father of the murdered family. It was a desperate plea for help, a cry that had gone unheard by the world beyond the village. In it, Georg confessed to a terrible secreter, dark pact made with a mysterious figure that promised power in exchange for the Gruber family's loyalty. The figure was Evelyn's ancestor, a woman who had first entered the village generations ago, bringing with her an ancient curse that had haunted the family ever since. The pact had been sealed in blood, in exchange for wealth, land, and power. The Grubers had sold their souls to the woman's family, forever binding them to the darkness that had plagued the village. It was this curse that had driven the family to madness, that had caused Georg and Andreas to fear their own children, to become increasingly paranoid and disconnected from reality. Paul's stomach twisted as he read Georg's final words. The curse will not end. It will claim us all, and when it does, it will move on to the next. There is no escape, no salvation. We have damned ourselves for eternity. But the letter revealed something even darker than Paul could have ever anticipated. Georg had written that the family's bloodline had been marked, not just by Evelyn's ancestor, but by the very land itself. The house, the barn, the fields, everything in the village was part of the curse. And the more Paul read, the more he understood. The murders had not been random acts of violence. Ritualistic plan one that had been set in motion long before Paul had ever arrived. As he finished reading, a cold chill swept over him. The pieces had fallen into place, but they painted a picture that was far worse than he had imagined. The Grubers had been victims of their own choices, trapped by their bloodline, manipulated by a woman who had inherited the power of the curse. And Carl, despite his attempts to fight it, had been another victim used by Evelyn to finish what her ancestors had started. Paul's mind spun with this newfound knowledge, but there was no time to process it fully. As he stood in the room, the very walls seemed to close in around him. The house had never felt more alive than it did in this moment, its energy pulsing with the weight of centuries of secrets, lies, and darkness. And then he heard it, the creak of a floorboard, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing through the halls. A voice, cold and steady, broke the silence. "You've figured it out, haven't you, Paul?" Evelyn's voice was calm, almost soothing, but there was an undeniable darkness in it, a hunger that could not be masked. Paul turned to face her, his heart pounding in his chest. There she stood, in the doorway, a figure from the shadows who had haunted him throughout the entire investigation. Evelyn was not just a person, she was the embodiment of the curse, the legacy of darkness that had been passed down through generations. Her beauty was haunting, but her eyes were cold, empty of humanity. "You," Paul breathed, his voice filled with both fear and disbelief. "You're the one. You've been behind all of this." Evelyn's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Yes, Paul, I am the one who has watched over this family's bloodline for centuries, and now you are a part of it. You cannot escape. None of you can." Paul's mind raced as he tried to process what she was saying. It all made sense. Now the curse, the killings, the strange happenings in the house. But why had she chosen him? Why had she brought him here? "You brought me here for a reason," Paul said, his voice shaking with anger and fear. "What do you want from me?" Evelyn stepped closer, her presence suffocating. "I need you, Paul. You've been chasing the wrong answers. The real question is not who killed the Grubers. It's who is ready to inherit their legacy, who will continue the work that they started." She paused, her eyes locking with his. "And you, Paul, are the one who has been chosen." Paul's stomach churned as the truth hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just a simple investigation. It had been a test, a trial designed to lure him into the heart of the curse. The Gruber family's fate was intertwined with his own, and now the house was asking him to take part in the ritual, to become part of the dark legacy that had haunted this village for generations. "No," Paul whispered, stepping back. "I won't let you do this. I won't be a part of this madness." Evelyn's expression hardened. "You don't have a choice, Paul. The curse is already inside you. It has been since you first set foot in this house. You've been marked." The air in the room seemed to thicken, and the shadows seemed to stretch toward Paul as if the house itself was reaching out to claim him. He could feel the weight of it, the darkness closing in, the pressure of a legacy that was not his to carry. But then something inside him shifted. A spark of resistance, of defiance, ignited within Paul. He had come too far to back down now. The truth had been revealed, and he couldn't allow Evelyn or the curse to take hold of him. He wasn't going to be another pawn in her twisted game. "You're wrong," Paul said, his voice growing stronger. "I will end this. I will stop you." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. "You think you can stop me?" she hissed. "You think you can change your fate?" Paul stepped forward, his hands shaking, but his resolve unbroken. "I will fight you," he said, "and I will fight the darkness. I'll break the cycle, once and for all." All the room seemed to pulse with a final, terrifying energy, as if the very house was aware of the battle taking place within it. The darkness that had once threatened to swallow him now felt smaller, more manageable. Paul knew that the true battle was not against Evelyn, but against the darkness within himself. And as the shadows closed in, Paul made a choice. He would face the curse, face the truth, and fight for his soul. The final confrontation was coming, and Paul would not back down. Chapter 14: Healing or Destruction. The town of Hinterkaifeck, once cloaked in mystery and dark secrets, was now bathed in the dim light of an early morning sun. The quiet village had been irrevocably altered by the tragic events of the past weeks, and Paul stood at the edge of the woods, looking out across the fog-covered fields. His mind was a maelstrom of confusion and revelation, haunted by the memories of the Gruber family, the evil that had infiltrated the village, and the shocking truth he had unearthed about himself. The investigation that had begun as a simple search for answers had twisted into something far more profound. He had uncovered the family's hidden history, discovered the darkness that had been passed down through generations, and faced down the very woman who had been the source of the curse that had plagued this village. Yet, despite his hard-won knowledge, Paul still felt no peace. The mysteries had been solved, the killer's identity revealed, but the emotional toll had been far greater than he had anticipated. The truth was crueler than anything he could have imagined. It wasn't just about solving a crime. It was about a cycle of pain and destruction that had been going on for centuries, with no real end in sight. The Gruber family had been victims of a curse tied to their bloodline, to the very land they had inhabited. And the person responsible for the murders, the true killer, was not just an individual, but an embodiment of the curse itself. The final confrontation with Evelyn, the woman who had orchestrated the killings and manipulated Carl, had left Paul shaken to his core. He had fought her, confronted the darkness she represented, but the cost of victory had been high. In the end, Evelyn had disappeared, her fate uncertain. But Paul knew that she was not truly gone. The curse would linger, and with it, the memories of what had transpired in that house. He had been changed. The darkness had touched him, and though he had come through the confrontation physically unscathed, the emotional scars would stay with him forever. The man who had entered Hinterkaifeck, determined to find answers, was no longer the same. He had seen too much, understood too deeply the nature of the evil that resided within the world and within himself. The investigation had stripped him of his innocence, leaving him with a profound sense of loss and a deep fear of the future. As Paul stood there, lost in thought, a small figure approached from behind. Johann, the old villager who had warned Paul of the curse from the beginning, walked up to him, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and resignation. "You've done it, Paul," Johann said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "You've uncovered the truth, but now you must live with it." Paul turned to face Johann, his expression weary. "I don't know if I can," he replied, his voice hollow. "The cost has been too high. I've lost myself in this everything I believed in. Everything I stood for." Johann nodded slowly, as if he understood the weight of Paul's words. "The truth is a burden, Paul," he said, "but it's also a gift. You've seen the darkness that lies beneath the surface, and now you must choose whether you let it consume you or whether you use what you've learned to heal yourself and others." Paul looked out at the fields again, his eyes distant. The village, the house, the memories, it all felt like it belonged to someone else, someone who had died a long time ago. He had uncovered the secrets of the Gruber family, but in doing so, he had uncovered his own soul. The darkness, the obsession, it had all taken root in him. He could feel it gnawing at the edges of his mind. But Johann's words gave him pause. Maybe there was still a chance for him to find some peace. Maybe, after all this, there was a way to heal. "You're right," Paul said, his voice stronger now. "I have to face what I've learned. I have to let it go." He turned back to you, his eyes resolute. "I can't change the past, but I can change what happens next." Johann smiled faintly, his weathered face softening. "That's all any of us can do, Paul. Move forward. Let go of the darkness and find the light again." For the first time since he arrived in Hinterkaifeck, Paul felt a small spark of hope. The past would always haunt him, the memories of the Grubers, the horrors he had uncovered. But he could choose how he lived with them. He could choose to use the knowledge he had gained to help others to heal, even if it meant accepting the parts of himself that had been broken. As Paul turned to leave the village, a sense of resolution settled over him. The case was closed, but the emotional scars would remain. He had faced down the darkness and lived to tell the tale, but he knew that his journey was far from over. The truth had been unveiled, but the aftermath was only just beginning. Chapter 15. A new beginning. Paul stood at the edge of the village, staring out at the horizon. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the rolling hills that surrounded Hinterkaifeck. The village, though still heavy with the weight of its past, seemed different now. The shadows that had once haunted the streets had begun to fade, replaced by the soft light of a new day. But for Paul, the light felt faint, distant. The investigation had come to an end. The murderer had been revealed, the secrets uncovered, and the curse exposed for all to see. And yet, as Paul prepared to leave the village behind, he couldn't help but feel that there was something missing, something he couldn't put into words. The journey had changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The man who had entered the village months ago, eager to uncover the truth, had been transformed into someone else, someone darker, more cynical, and more aware of the evil that lurked just beneath the surface of the world he had witnessed. Horrors that few could comprehend, and he had paid a price for it. The emotional scars he carried were deep, and the weight of the knowledge he had gained was a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. But despite the darkness, there was a small flicker of light within him. The truth had been brutal, but it had also given him clarity. The village, the case, the darkness had all led him to this moment, to a place where he could choose his path. And for the first time in months, Paul felt a glimmer of hope. He could still heal. He could still move forward. As Paul took one last look at Hinterkaifeck, he made a choice. The shadows of the past would always be there, lurking at the edges of his mind, but he could not let them control him. He would carry the lessons he had learned, the pain he had endured, and the truths he had uncovered. But he would not let them define him. The village behind him, its dark history now laid bare, would fade into the past. Paul would leave it behind, but he would never forget. The scars would remain, but they would be part of the man he was becoming. A man who had faced the darkest parts of himself and chosen to move forward with one final breath. Paul turned away from the village and walked into the unknown, his heart heavy but his steps steady. A new chapter awaited him, a chapter where he would begin to heal, to rebuild, and to live. The story of Hinterkaifeck was over, but Paul's journey was just beginning.